Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about my project, a Flask application that uses Redis and Flask limiter for rate limiting. I'm going to start by talking about the Docker Compose file. So when we run Docker Compose up, a couple of things are going to happen. First, Docker is going to create a default network, and then it's going to pull the latest Redis image from Docker Hub, build the container, and then attach that container to our default network. And then it's going to build our web container based on our Docker file, and it's going to attach that container to our default network. So now let's look at our Docker file. In our Docker file, we're specifying our base image as a version of Debian Buster with Python 3.8 installed. And then we're setting our working directory and copying all of our files into that working directory. Then we're installing all of our Python dependencies. We're exposing port 5000, and then finally, we're running the app. Now let's take a look at the app. So in the app, the first thing that I'm doing is I'm creating a Flask instance and a Flask limiter instance. And the other thing that I'm doing is I'm defining routes for the root URL and for the API. For the API route, we can see that it has this Flask limiter decorator, which is limiting the number of requests to 3 requests per second. And I think that the Flask limiter API obscures what's going on in the background. So what I've done is I've written this code so that we can have an idea of what's actually going on. So essentially, Flask limiter is a class where with one property, which is a connection to a Redis database, and one method, which is our rate limiter. By default, Flask limiter uses a fixed window method, and that's what this method is here. So limit is a decorator factory, which means that it returns a decorator, which returns a wrapper. And inside that wrapper, what I'm doing is I'm generating a unique key, and then I'm atomically incrementing and timeouting that key in the Redis database. And finally, I'm checking to see if the value of that key is greater than the number of requests that we're limiting. If it is greater than, then we're going to return a 429 status, which means that that client has too many requests. And otherwise, we're just going to return the function. And in this case, our function just returns some dummy JSON back to the client. The other route is the root URL, and all that this does is render the HTML document. So by default, Flask looks for HTML in the templates directory. And in our HTML here, the most important thing is that we have one button. And when you click this button, it calls the call API function. So let's take a look at the JavaScript. And in our JavaScript, we can see the call API function. And all that this does is calls our API, and it logs our data if the response is OK, and otherwise it handles the error. We'll also take a quick look at our CSS, and this is just the Meyer reset so that our web page looks exactly the same across all browsers. So now that we know how everything works independently, let's take a look at how everything works together. So once everything is up and running, Flask will create a Whiskey server, and a Whiskey server is just a server that allows our web page to talk to our Python code. And whenever a client sends a request to the server will forward the request to Flask, and Flask will route that request to the correct function. If that function has our rate limiter decorator, then it will talk to Redis, and Redis will either return a 429 status, or it will return a 200 status, which is OK. In that case, our Python code will process the request and then return the response back to Flask. In either case, whether we return the 429 or we return the processed request, Flask will then send that response back to the server, which will then forward the response back to the client. So now that we know how everything works, let me sign on to my virtual machine. And we'll take a look at the Docker app in action. So I already have my terminal pulled up. in the directory with my app. So we're going to run the app by doing docker compose up. All right, and just like I talked about earlier, the first thing that happens is that Docker creates the default network, and then it builds the Redis container and attaches that to the network. And then it builds the web container and also attaches that to the network. And down here in the logs, we can see that Flask has started the Whiskey server and that it's listening on port 5000. And just to confirm that our containers are running, we can use Docker PS. And now that we know that our containers are up and running, we can navigate in our browser to localhost 5000. And what I'll also do is open up the dev tools so that we can see what's going on in the background. So let me reload the page. So we can see that the document, the style sheet, the JavaScript, and the favicon have all loaded correctly. And now what I'll do is I will call the API by clicking the Call API button. And we can see that that worked correctly, and we get the 200 response, which means that our API is working correctly. And we can verify that it's working by going to our console and seeing that we have the dummy JSON. So let's go back to the network, and what I'm going to do is make 4 really quick API calls. And we can see that the first 3 API calls come back with a 200 response, but the 4th one comes back with 429, which makes sense because that means that our rate limiter, which is limiting to 3 requests per second, is working correctly. And we can confirm that it's working correctly by looking at our console, and we can see that these first 3 are fine, but the 4th one gets caught by our JavaScript. So now let's close the application. To do that, we can do docker compose down. And while this is closing up, I just want to say thank you for watching. And if you're interested in learning more about my project, you can check it out on GitHub. And that's it. Thanks.